Hey students, I want to talk to you about how we are going to incorporate quotes within our essay, since we're going to be doing that in our compare and contrast. While I am recording right now, you might hear some funky trumpet sounds in the background, and that's just my daughter 3 rooms away trying to practice her trumpet. So I'm really sorry, but I wanted to get this video done and uploaded for you. So hopefully a lot of you have some familiarity with putting quotes from an outside source within your own essay and how to do that. If you've never done that before, I am going to show you sort of from point A to point B. But if you do remember some of that, maybe from high school or previous English class, it's exactly what we'll be talking about. So I'm going to give you, I think, 8 rules today to sort of just as general guidelines. Number 1, you always want to have a reason to quote. So you never want to just fill up your essay with outside sources. The essays should be mostly you talking, and a quote should only be used if it is if it backs up, supports, provides evidence for something that you're saying. And it should only be used, a direct quote should only be used if it's striking, meaning that you can't say it any better. Maybe the idea is too complicated, or the way that the expert had phrased it was kind of a unique and kind of maybe a really insightful or just a way that maybe you couldn't phrase it in your own words. So that said, there are 3 ways to think about including outside sources. There's direct quoting. So that's quoting, that means exactly word for word. Whatever the outside source said, you're going to put that quote in actual quotation marks. And the other 2 are indirect. So that's summary and paraphrase. A summary is when we take somebody else's information and we put it in our own words, kind of like just a brief overview of what they said. We still have to give that person credit for their ideas, even if we change that into our own words. The second indirect way to cite a source is to paraphrase. So that's in your own words, but it's still the source's ideas. Again, in all 3 of these cases, you would make sure that you give an appropriate citation for whoever's ideas those originally were. So in your compare and contrast introduction, you need to introduce the readers to the book and the author. So somewhere in your very first paragraph, I should have mentioned that in the outline, and I think several of you did follow that advice. But if you didn't, here's your chance to sort of go back and revise that. Make sure you do italicize the Book of Unknown Americans, right? A novel is a complete work unto itself, so we want to make sure that it is italicized or underlined, not both. You will also want to make sure that we introduce the author, so Cristina Enriquez, and make sure that you spell her name correctly. Some Cristinas spell their name with a CH, our author does not. Once you mention her by full name, if you refer to the author again, you can just call her by her last name only. You would not call her Christina because you do not know her personally. So we often refer to people that we do not know, especially other professionals, by their last name only after we've introduced them. So the way that a quote works, this is just the sort of basic anatomy of the quote. And forgive me, some of my arrows are kind of pointing funky, but I'll try to show you. So here's the quote itself. Let's pretend this existed in my essay. According to Alma, quote, "The limitations were clear. We couldn't walk through the door without someone to guide us to the other side." Page number, end quote. So notice the way that I've set my quote up here is that I am always going to make sure it is clear to the reader who is speaking, whose ideas were these. And in fact, these came from Alma the character. Now, overall, right, they came from Cristina Enriquez, but that's not how we quote this. We are quoting what the character actually said or felt. So notice now it's a speaker. Between the what's called a signal phrase and the actual quotation, we actually have a comma here to distinguish between what is said and who actually said it. Notice we have the quotation, and then we have the full word for word, exactly as it appears in the book, quote, and then we have an unquote. Notice here that we've actually moved this end punctuation to go outside of our page number. And that's what's listed here in the parentheses as the page number. So I could flip right over to page 27. In fact, I'm going to do it right now. And I'm going to scan all the way down to it's almost to the second to last line where this appears, right? And that just lets our reader know where we got that information. So that's basically what a lot of in-text citations look like. So here's an example from the Book of Unknown Americans. And again, I just pretend that this appeared in my essay. Although Alma has kept the incident with Garrett Miller from Arturo, when Maribel goes missing, Alma must confess. She thinks to herself, what did it matter? My instinct to protect him. My misguided idea that somehow by keeping all this from him, I could prove I was capable. I could prove that I could take care of our daughter even though I had failed her so terribly before. Page 243. And you'll notice it's very clear where Alma's ideas start and where they stop because of the quotation marks. Okay? So rule number 2 here, readers should always know who is talking. Especially in a book like this where we have lots of characters, we want to make sure it's always clear at all times. So make sure all direct and indirect quotes have a name or some kind of attribution tag in the sentence, okay? So remember that a direct quote is word for word. So if I were to look on page 39, right, what appears here in quotation marks is exactly what Mayor says, right? Mayor says that his, quote, parents were so wrapped up in their own problems that they barely registered him. Now, I'll explain these brackets in just a minute if you give me a chance. But again, notice here our end punctuation doesn't appear until outside of the page number. We want to keep all that information together so that it's clear for the reader. If I were to take this same idea and just to put it into my own summary or paraphrase, right? It's an indirect quote, but I still have to give a citation here. So I might say something like, because Celia and Raphael have their own problems to deal with, Mayor often feels neglected that his parents won't notice him. Again, I would make sure I give the page number here, right? We want to always tell the reader, hey reader, here's where I got this information from, okay? All right, rule 3, use a colon to introduce a sentence, to introduce a quotation with a full sentence, okay? So if what appears before the quotation is a full sentence, Mayor is in love, right? We could actually put a period behind that sentence, right? In this case, I want to keep all this stuff together because what I'm about to show in the evidence actually proves that point, right? Mayor is in love, colon. My heart was jackhammering so hard I thought people from the next aisle were going to start complaining about the noise. Again, notice here there's no end punctuation. I've kept the page number within that end punctuation so it's all super clear. Here's another way. Alma is quick to judge herself and her actions. Notice here the colon, what I'm talking about. Why hadn't I stopped that car earlier? I should have run into the middle of the street waving my arms. Right, page 65, then the period. Again, that's actually how you use a colon in even outside of quotations, is there should be a full sentence in front of it before the colon appears. Rule 4 says if you use the word that to set up a quotation, do not use a comma after it. So if I say something like, Mayor says that his parents were so wrapped up in their own problems that they barely registered him, right? The word that right here means that I actually don't have to put a comma right there. And that's just a grammatical rule that kind of helps you know when and where to use that comma. Rule 5, quote exactly. So you do have to quote word for word, punctuation mark for punctuation mark, except in the end, except in the case of end punctuation, where you eliminate the end punctuation in order to place a period after the page number. So you have the power when you are using outside sources to move all end punctuation to the outside of the parentheses, which will contain your page numbers there, okay? If you would like to use a quote, but not the whole quote, right? Let's say you're taking a part of a sentence out, you can use the ellipses. And these are 3 spaced periods that tell your reader that you took out information from that sentence, that it's missing in your quote. Okay, so, and if you've never known how to use an ellipses before, this is exactly how you would use an ellipses grammatically. There are 3 space periods. Even when you text your friends, right, you should actually be doing period, space, period, space, period, space. and it signals missing information. Sometimes I know millennials like to use it as though they're thinking about something or for a pause, but that's actually not what it's used for. If you skip a whole sentence or more when you're quoting something, you need to add a fourth period to the ellipses to signify that you've actually skipped a whole sentence. Rule 6, adjusting a quote to fit. So keep in mind that it's up to you to keep the grammar and the clarity of the quote. If you have to change a quote, or a word within that quote, you're going to want to use brackets to indicate where you have actually changed the word. So that's all that the brackets mean within a quote, is that sometimes we just want to clarify. I think a lot of times this happens with pronouns in particular, but we want to clarify who's talking or maybe who the action is happening to. So in the original quote, Mayor is talking in the book, and he says, "My parents were so wrapped up in their own problems that they barely even registered me." And if I wanted to use that quote in my essay, my perspective changes a little bit, my point of view, right? I would say that Mayor says that his parents were so wrapped up in their own problems that they barely registered him. So for me, it would make much more sense for my readers if I changed that word "me" in the original quote to "him" to stay consistent with how I set up this quote and clarity who him is, right? So I would indicate to my reader with the brackets that I changed the last word here. Me changed to him. Okay? So if you want to quote something that is quotations, right, that already has quotes in the book, which there's lots of great lines of dialogue here, right, you have to do a quote within a quote. So if I look at page 142, right, Mayor is talking to Maribel here, and he says to her, "I picked out the red one so it would match your sunglasses." Remember, this is when he's bought her a scarf for Christmas and he's giving it to her, right? So he actually says this aloud in the book, and it has quotation marks around it. And maybe I want to use that in my essay. So what I have to do is indicate with 3, right, quotation marks here. You use the regular "to" and then you use an apostrophe, that this is a quote within a quote. So it might read something like this. Notice this part is these are my words, right? And where you have the actual quote appears the 3 around it. Mayor is thoughtful and shows how much he cares by buying Maribel a thoughtful Christmas present. He tells her, quote, "I picked out a red one so that it would match your sunglasses." Again, notice there's 3 before I end, no end punctuation, page number, then the punctuation. This is probably the most important part here, is to explain your quote. You never, ever, ever just want to give a quote and then get out of the paragraph, right? That happens, I think, a lot of times with students when they're not really sure what the function of their outside information is. So make sure you're asking yourself, well, hey, how am I going to explain this? Or how am I going to connect this back to my, topic sentence or my thesis? So sometimes we call this a hanging quote, and it just kind of means that it's kind of hanging in the air, right? You didn't really explain it and you didn't really say anything. You might have just ended with a paragraph with a quote. Which reminds me, if you're ending a paragraph with a quote and you didn't explain it, there's a problem there, right? And you will get marked down for that kind of stuff, so make sure you have explained it. So again, it's the same quote here. Remember, this is what Mayor is saying, so it's a quote within a quote. "It's alpaca," I said again, like I was suddenly some kind of alpaca salesman or something. This kind of self-doubt keeps Mayor humble and genuine. He is not boasting to Maribel about the quality of the gift. He simply wants to point out how much he thought about her when he bought the scarf. This self-deprecation and earnestness makes him likable. So I'm using that quote to show exactly the kind of character or personality that Mayor has. And I use that quote, but then I spend a couple of sentences explaining what my point is, right? All right, so those are your basic 8 rules. Hopefully you wrote those down. If not, pause this video and go back and write them down. You will have a quiz question dedicated to those rules. So You do have to have a works cited page for this particular essay. And if you are using the same book that I am, which is a paperback version, actually the cover kind of looks like this. It's sort of a teal book cover with a little girl and the braid on the back. But anyways, getting back to the works cited page, all that a works cited page means is that it's your list of sources that you consulted, and it appears at the end of your essay. It's going to list all the sources you quoted, you paraphrased, or that you summarized in your essay. And for our essay, for sure, you're going to be using the Book of Unknown Americans. You are not required to have any other additional outside sources, but I'm just kind of prepping you because your fourth essay, you're going to have multiple sources that'll go into that essay. So again, think of that works cited page as sort of the list of everything that you consulted for that essay. Think of the in-text citation as the key word that will lead me to the index. I'll get back to that when we have multiple sources that appear in our argument essays. But the general guidelines for works cited is that all of our sources are going to be arranged in alphabetical order by last name of the author. So just like as my roster appears, right, your last name comes up first, comma, and then your first name, that's going to be the same with our authors. The whole list is its own page, so it gets its own header, which will just say works cited, and all of the entries are going to be double spaced, so both within and between entries, just like with the paragraphs, right? Some of you had trouble with that on your last essay. There's no extra spacing that happens. It stays double spaced throughout the whole essay. The second or the subsequent line of each entry is going to be indented even more than, is going to be indented. So if you have 2 or 3 lines, right, just that the second and the third line would actually be indented under the first entry. And all you have to really think about when it comes to works cited is who wrote it, what is it, when was it written, and where can I find it? That's the basic information that's going to go into a works cited page. A lot of times students like to use things like EasyBib that just give you the citation. And EasyBib is fine to use if you have all that information. Inevitably, what I've noticed is that students who use those kind of tools don't actually have all the right information, so your citation is wrong no matter what. So EasyBib is only as good as you as the information you give it. So again, on the Book of Unknown Americans, we're going to make sure we put that on our works cited page. We're going to give the author's full name, last name first, comma, first name, and any middle initials. Omit any titles such as doctor or PhD, and the name with a period. So in fact, if I actually pull up and shift this over so you can see it, I'm just going to sort of do this just so you could see what it would look like. Oh, my layout's kind of off here. Make sure that's all right. So let's pretend I'm student, last name, right? This is exactly what the header should look like. English 475, today's date. Yes. Notice that today's date is in the international date format. Again, some of you got that marked down. So here's my title, right? In the beginning of this essay, blah, 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 right? I'm just pretending that I'm sort of starting this just so I can show you what this would look like. Now, if I was going to have a works cited page, I'd make sure it's on its own page here. I want to make sure that this is centered. It just should say works cited. So one thing that we'll do here is we'll put the author's last name, comma, first name. Oops. And then notice again that the period goes after her name. We want to make sure that we get the title of the book correct. And notice that it is italicized. Just going to double check here. Then we're going to want to have the company that actually published it. So the publishing company would come next, which is Vintage Contemporaries, and a colon, and where was it published? The year it was published, which was 2014, and then how I access that book. So what that means is, for those of you using digital versions of this, you did not use a print version of that. And this is really important here, because if you have a different version of the book than I do, when I am double checking your sources, if your page numbers are different because your publisher is different, or your version of the book is different, you're using an ebook, right? Then you need to make sure that I have the information of the book that you have, so you don't get marked down for misquoting the wrong page number. Does that make sense? So when I was mentioning having a second or third line indented, that's all that means, right? Is here our citation falls on a second line, I'd make sure that that's indented underneath that. And that's all I would have to do here. If I only use this one source, this is the only thing that would appear here. Now, if I had another source, let's say you read the great book by the wonderful Vicky Telacro, right? Right, something like that. Your next citation would sort of go right after that. And again, it's listed by alphabetical, so my name would certainly appear after, but that's only if you consulted that, okay? The other thing I would note here is just make sure that you do have your last name and the page number at the top. So right side, top. Sometimes with this stuff, you have to kind of get in there and play with it a little bit, double click around. I know one thing that drives me crazy is it always formats in Cambria font, which is not the font that we use in the humanities, so I always make sure that I change it. But notice it'll automatically format to the next page, so however many pages that you have. So make sure, especially for those of you that have a different version of the book than I do, that you do get all the right information on there. And certainly if you have questions, I want you to email and ask me about that. Okay, so that's briefly just what quoting an outside source looks like. The other thing I want to talk to you about today is paragraph development. This is really important in all of your essays, but certainly with the compare and contrast can get a little bit more tricky. I have a sense that most of you will organize your essays in the point by point structure versus the block by block. The block by block can be a little bit more tricky depending on how you approach it. Remember that the first half of the essay in a block by block will be about subject A, and the back half of the essay will be about subject B. What gets tricky about this particular structure is that when you are talking about subject B, you do have to remind the reader what happened with subject A. How are they similar and how are they different? If you do not do that in the block by block structure, you simply talked about two different things and you put them in an essay next to each other, and you never really had any connecting information about them. So be sure, if you do choose the block by block structure, that you are cognizant that you really need to make sure you sort of tie those subjects to each other. But in the paragraph alone, that's what I'm talking about here. In the point by point, we are going to make sure we have a topic sentence, right? Which point are we comparing and contrasting, right? Of course, a topic sentence is the main idea of the whole paragraph, and it should directly support the thesis here. So the way that I would kind of break this down in my actual paragraph, remember just the paragraph alone, is after my topic sentence, I would make sure I give an example or a piece of evidence from subject A, and then I might explain how that evidence or that example supports that body paragraph. Sometimes it's pretty clear, but not always. So again, writing isn't really prescriptive, and it's hard for instructors to tell you this is how you should do it, but you kind of have to say, okay, what does my reader need here? Do they need that explanation of how those things are tied together, or is it fairly obvious? Then you might want to transition and connect to subject B, provide an example or a piece of evidence for subject B, and then explain how that evidence or example supports the thesis. You might even explain how these things, right, are similar and or different, excuse me. In a block by block pattern, right, the topic sentence should specifically be about subject A in this example, right? Then we will give some evidence, maybe multiple pieces of evidence for subject A, and we'll explain how that evidence supports the body paragraph. Excuse me, I didn't mean to jump so fast. So notice that here we're only talking about that particular subject. Again, as I mentioned, later when we talk about subject B, we'll want to have a lot more connecting sentences back to subject A. So if I was going to compare in the Book of Unknown Americans, Alma and Celia, one topic that I might choose to cover is how they mother their children. If you've noticed, Alma is incredibly protective over Maribel, and perhaps some of that comes out of Maribel's condition. Perhaps Alma didn't used to be that overprotective, but now she really, really is, especially because they're in a place that they are unfamiliar with, and Maribel doesn't always seem to know exactly what's going on. So for me, if I was going to write about Alma, I'd want to come up with just a brief little list of moments that would prove how overprotective Alma is of Maribel. And the first one that came to mind is the bus example, when she gets stuck on the bus and is really, really frantic about finding Maribel or getting there to the apartment before Maribel does. The second one is when, just ignore that. When she catches him with Maribel, excuse me, with Garrett Miller. And this is a terrifying moment for Alma because this is the exact kind of thing she does not want to happen to Maribel. And then there's that moment when they're all ice skating and she can't see Maribel. And she has this kind of panic moment when she should know that Maribel is somewhere nearby. But for her, Alma needs to see her in order to feel like that Maribel is safe. Celia, on the other hand, she's a tough mom too, but she's not overly protective. She does allow Mayor to have some freedom, and so I just sort of jotted down a couple examples that I could think of. And for me, I try to be really organized when I'm doing some research and I'm flipping through the book. You'll notice here that I've already included the page numbers of these examples. And this is just a shorthand for myself, so that way I don't have to spend a whole bunch of time going back and forth trying to find what I'm looking for. So, what I'm going to do is just pretend, right, that I am going to write one body paragraph. That's all I'm going to do, just to show you an example of how I would actually develop this paragraph. So I kind of came up with a rough topic sentence here. So again, as I mentioned, I'm talking about their mothering skills. And so the way that I have structured this topic sentence says, although Alma and Celia are both very nurturing mothers, Alma is much more protective over Maribel than Celia is over Mayor. And notice here, I'm proving a couple of things. One is I'm trying to prove that both women are similar in that they're both very nurturing mothers. However, there's a back half to this, and I'm proving that there's a difference in their mothering skills because Alma is much more protective over Maribel than Celia is over Mayor. Okay, you do not have to structure your topic sentences in a point-by-point like this where you offer similarities and differences. This is just an example to show you how I did it. You could certainly just stick with, go back, right? That both of these women are nurturing and provide examples. So again, I'm going to keep that topic sentence here in green so you can see it. That didn't change. Here, if I can spell nurturing right, I'm going to just make a little list, provide some evidence to prove how both women are nurturing. So I wrote here, Alma is, come on, Vicky. All right, Alma is patient with Maribel and helps her with her homework even if Alma doesn't fully understand it herself. Alma reminds herself to, quote, take a deep breath, take a deep breath, and that it's only the beginning of the year. This comes from the moment when Alma is trying to be really patient with Maribel and help her with her homework. And you can see how I quoted that, right? Here's the page number, and then there's a period on the outside of that. Then I'd want to make sure that I tie that to Celia. Likewise, right? So that means that they have a similarity. So this is a comparison. Likewise, Celia cares about Mayor's grade. For example, when the counselor tells Celia and Rafa that Mayor's grades have fallen, they punish Mayor. Of course, Mayor is punished severely because he lied about not playing soccer, but the point is that Mayor's parents care deeply about Mayor's academics and athletics. So again, I'm just trying to pull a similarity between the two sets of parents, that they both genuinely care for their kids' education, right? Again, keeping with the same topic sentence here, now I'm going to just try to write a couple of sentences that prove and provide evidence that shows how protective they are. So in the case of Alma, I felt that the moment when Alma is late to pick up Maribel from the bus was definitely the strongest piece of evidence that I had of how panicked she gets when she does not feel like she is in control of Maribel. So my sentence would say, however, Alma is incredibly protective over Maribel. She feels a sense of panic whenever she cannot see Maribel. One time when Alma was running late from the bus, she was almost frantic with finding Maribel. Alma said, quote, I gasped and ran to her, lifting her sunglasses off, cupping her face in my hands, studying it for bruises, for anything that might seem amiss. Even though Maribel has been returned to Alma, Alma feels the need to inspect her daughter for damage. So again, you can see that I'm just providing that as an example to prove how frightened and overprotective that she is. By contrast, I would say Celia, on the other hand, treats Mayor like he is more mature. To be sure, Celia is concerned for Mayor's safety, but she also wants him to follow the rules of the house, especially when he is caught kissing Maribel in his father's car. And so, even though both women are concerned mothers, they will each have varying degrees of protectiveness when it comes to their children. And you can see what I did. I took the topic sentence, a little bit about Alma in the red, right? Connected that with Celia's nurturing point, right? Talked about how protective Alma is, and then talked about how protective or not protective that Celia is, and then had kind of a wrap-up sentence here reminding the reader about what these women have in common. So your body paragraphs should actually look somewhat the same, right? If it's a point-by-point, that is. One thing that you do want to be careful of is whiplash. What you don't want to have here is a red sentence about Alma and a blue sentence about Celia. Alma, Celia, Alma, Celia, Alma, Celia. What happens in that case is you give your readers whiplash. They just go back and forth too quickly between the two subjects. So be very aware of that. For your body paragraphs, I really want you to plan them well. Support them with evidence from the book. Connect them to the other subject. So again, if you're not comparing Alma to Celia, maybe you're comparing Alma to your mother, make sure you do connect the two subjects together. Make sure you use transitions when necessary and follow all those rules of quoting and citing appropriately. And be sure that you're clear and that the logic is really easy to follow for a reader. So sometimes I ask my students, well, what's the point of this information? Sometimes as a writer, you have to be explicit about that. Okay, so you can do this. All you really have to do is start by adding and revising your outline. Then just start one idea and one sentence at a time. So remember, your body paragraph should be in-depth, provide evidence, and demonstrate each of the points that you have. Okay? So that said, this week only, I'll be offering some extra credit. If you write your rough draft this week, they're not going to be due until next week, but just as an incentive to get you to write that rough draft and start working on it now, if you write the full draft of your rough draft and you stop by my office hours, I have office hours Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you can earn 10 points of extra credit. Now, if you can't make it during my hours of office hours, you can certainly email me for another time. And I will see what I have available outside of that, and perhaps we can video conference with that. But this, again, is just an incentive so that A, you can write your rough draft, and B, I can give you some feedback, and you can see how helpful it is when you work with your instructors on big projects like that. All right, you guys. Please be sure to watch this video a couple of times if you still have some questions about citations or where punctuation goes. Certainly if you need to do another DLA, because that deadline will be coming up soon. They do have DLAs on works cited and in-text citations. So choose one of those DLAs to kind of help you practice that skill so that it's really a practical application for you. So I'll see you guys on the discussion board. Bye.